Okay, so in this second lecture, I want to focus in more on the young adult leader. Like when you think about the young adult leader, who might that be? Maybe you think of yourself, or you think of what it ought to be and all that comes with that. But as we thought about this idea of resourcing, not only did we want to know like where there was resourcing happening and who the influencing resourcers were, but we also wanted to think about the young adult leader. Like, who are you? Like, how much time do you spend on this? Like, what do you need? What's the dynamic like? What are you thinking about? And so what we did is we talked with a lot of people that identified as working in young adult ministry, and we tried to ask that question. And so here's some things that we found. Let me open this up and I'll take you there. So I want to look at some young adult ministry snapshots. So what we did is we, as we had these conversations with just multiple people that identified as being young adult leaders, we came up with 3 leader composites. Now, these aren't exhaustive, doesn't mean that there aren't other kinds of leaders, but remember, our goal is to bring some clarity and some definition about who we're talking about so that we can serve them better. That's the goal, like not to label, it's to understand and to bring definition, right? So here's what we came up with. A couple of things first, though. First of all, when it came to budget, and we asked them, like, well, what's your young adult ministry budget like? What we found is that 28% of the churches, the ministries that we talked with, had no budget. So a third of young adult ministry leaders told us that they have no budget. Okay, that's really important. Okay, I'll explain why in a second. Secondly, about 60% said that they had a budget from $1 to $5,000. Okay, it's a big range, we know, but that's about 60% of that. Only 13% had a budget of over $5,000. Now, why is that important? Well, you know, as we think about young adult ministry, and from our perspective as a resourcing training organization, I have to keep in mind that, like, you all, a majority, like what, 80+%, don't have like a ton of cash to go to a week-long cohort or invest in like some high ticket item. The chances are is that a lot of that money, if you have any money, is used to meet with young adults, or to do a retreat, or to subsidize some of the work that you're doing, right? So the training dollars that young adult ministries have are pretty small at this point. Now, we can fight for more, and I'm all about that, and I'm going to certainly do that. But we also have to realize and recognize what's there. So that actually shapes the way we think about our training and what we're offering and what we're making available to be most effective. The other thing that we found was this, is that when we ask young adult leaders, like, well, how much time do you spend doing young adult ministry? They said they spend about 12.5 hours a week on young adult ministry. Now, there's a lot of reasons for this. Their job as a young adult ministry leader isn't their only job. A lot of times they're volunteer. Sometimes they are a youth pastor that's doing young adult ministry. Sometimes they are a family pastor that is also doing a bunch of other things. And so what you have is you have divided attention toward young adult ministry. The people with the biggest hearts and the best intentions still have limited time. Again, a really important thing for us to keep in mind, because it has an effect on how we will work with young adults and young adult leaders and the spaces that they have to do that. So then we were like, okay, so then who are these young adult leaders? And so we came up with 3 personas, again, not to label, but to give us a picture of who's out there. And so our first persona is full-time Felicity. She's 35. She has a bachelor's degree. She's in a sort of a traditional church size of about 450, which is about average, maybe a little above average. She is working with about 70 young adults. They don't all necessarily show up at church, but that's on the roll, and that's what she's working with. And she is the director of young adult ministry. So this actually is like her focus. And what she would say is maybe something like this: I love serving young adults, but also wish there were more resources available for this kind of ministry. I have to make it up as I go along. Okay, we've heard this over and over again. Her goals are to build a young adult ministry and to help young adults build relationships with older adults and to bridge this gap between the youth group and the adult congregation, right? So they're really thinking about like, what's this in between space and how do we help young adults get there? Her frustrations are that she would say, my supervisors don't really understand what young adults need. Young adults transience is real, and so it's hard to build a consistent community of young adults because young adults are coming and going. And then she says, I don't know anyone else doing this kind of work, and I need more ministry ideas. So she feels a sense of isolation. She doesn't really feel as though that she's supported by her leadership because they don't really understand, and it's hard to get traction simply because young adults come and go. And so maybe a story she would tell is this. In addition to running the Sunday night young adult service, I've been texting young adults in our community every week and doing regular one-on-ones to support young adults and what they're going through. However, my supervisor told me I should focus more on events to draw bigger crowds, even though that's not what our young adults need or want, okay? Maybe you can relate to that. Maybe you know someone that can relate to that, right? So here's full-time Felicity, who is the director of young adult ministry, trying to do the work, but feeling the pressure of limitations and expectations that are upon her. The question that comes back to us as we think about supporting someone like Felicity is, well, what does she need? How do we help her? She has to be on our horizon and in our vision to see that. Otherwise, we'll miss Felicity, and we don't want to do that. There's also our second persona is youth leader Peter. He's 33. He's got a bachelor's. He's at a non-denominational church, about an average church size of 250. He's about 20 young adults, and he's the youth and young adult director. Okay, so he's the youth director, but he also has the responsibility of young adults as well. And this is what he would say. He'd say, I care so much about my youth group graduates, but it's hard to support them when youth ministry is still my main focus. Okay, so his focus is on youth ministry. He cares about those that are graduating, but he feels a bit stuck. His goals are to help youth group grads know that they still belong in the church, to bridge the gap between youth group and adult congregation, and to get the church to prioritize young people everywhere, like all over the place, right? His frustrations are, though, is even though my supervisor has agreed to me adding young adults to my title, he only asks about the youth group. Okay, so the focus oftentimes can still be in the youth group, and young adults are sort of an afterthought, right? And then he also says, I don't have enough time or resources to serve young adults well. Remember the graph I showed you of resources before? That's probably true for youth leader Peter. His story would be this. He goes, I told some recent youth ministry graduates that they still belong in the church and can still come to the youth group if they want. One of them replied, I don't want to be youth ministry leftovers. It's sad, but I understand why it feels that way. Our church needs to do more to not just say they care about young adults, but to show it, okay? So here's youth leader Peter trying to uphold his commitment to youth ministry graduates, to somehow be that accompanying guide in this new space that they're entering into with a church that isn't fully understanding this transitional gap and what's going on there. And so this is what Peter's going through. Now, again, is it right or wrong? Doesn't really matter. This is perhaps what he's going through, and a lot of young adult leaders shared this similar description along the way. How do we help someone like that? Again, maybe you can relate to youth leader Peter. Our third persona is Wide Angle Will. He's 45. He has a MDiv. He's at an evangelical Protestant church size about 350. They have about 30 young adults, and he's the pastor of families and small groups. So he has this bigger scope that he's actually working with. And he'd say, I care about young adults, but they're not my only focus. His goals are to help young adults transition into the life of the church. He's thinking about that. He wants to support the parents of young adults. He wants to plug young adults into small group ministry and possibly start a mentoring ministry for young adults. So he has this larger scope sort of focus that he's interested in. His frustrations are this, that young adults come and go and rarely commit, even though they want community. I'm not sure if our church culture is hospitable to young adults. So he's feeling that tension. And he goes, I need more guidance on how to disciple young adults well. So he's thinking about them, but like once they show up, it seems like it's a challenge for him. And his story is, my senior pastor is still holding to the vision that young adults will meet each other at church, get married, and have kids that they'll raise in the church. The young adults I know are unlikely to fit this picture, but I'm not sure what alternative vision to provide that better captures young adults' place in the church, right? So remember we talked about earlier this defining the relationship, right? Wide angle Will has a heart for young adults, but doesn't necessarily know how they fit and how to communicate that to his leadership as well. Maybe you can relate to wide angle Will as a family pastor or an associate pastor or as a senior pastor. So again, these are not to label, but these help us see and feel the experiences that young adult leaders are working through, and it gives us the opportunity then to try to help them. Now, as we think about them, one of the other things that I wanted to point to, and this is actually in the appendices of Young Adult Ministry Now, is that we also discovered, as we talked with a lot of young adult leaders, that they don't have a job description for working with young adults. It either is too vague in the job description they have because their job description is bigger, or it's just literally not there. And so one of the things that we felt like we needed to do, and again, you can look at this in the book, but I have it here for you as well, is to begin to think about, like, how would I describe the work that I do in young adult ministry? Not only do we want to bring clarity to the personas from a FYI perspective, but I think for all of you, as you think about young adult ministry in your spheres, need to provide some clarity for your supervisors and for your congregation as to what actually young adult ministry is and what you're going to do. So I'm not going to run through all of these, but these were prompts to help you think about ministry in general. And then what I have is a column called budgeted hours. And here's where you can begin to put in, like, how many hours would you give weekly or monthly, however you do it, to each of these categories. This helps you see, like, how you're using your time and the percentage of time that you're dedicating to each of these, right? Now, whenever you make one of these that are new, you sort of project budgeted hours, but that changes by season, or you begin to learn as you get better at your job description that it may change. But if you can at least set the goal for that, it helps you manage your time. And then if you can keep track of actual hours, you can actually see where maybe you need to adjust your budgeted hours for future iterations by the month, or by the week or the month or the quarter or the year, or however you do that. So these honest conversations need to be had, so that actually happens along the way. I would say this is a great tool to use if you have a supervisor that hasn't given you a job description yet. You might say, hey, you know what, I've kind of thought about the hours that I give to young adult ministry and how I think they ought to be broken down. I did this work in class, and this really helped me bring clarity to my own job description. I'm wondering if you could look at it and you tell me what you think, and wondering if this can be a way that we can talk about the work that I'm doing in young adult ministry in the future. So you're inviting a more generative and specific conversation about the work that you're doing. And this can provide a template for you along the way. I think this can be really educational too. It helps supervisors and leaders that you report to see the work that you're doing, and you can really use this to your advantage to help educate them in the work that you're doing. Now, let me just give you one other advice here, and I give this advice to youth pastors as well. We are sometimes afraid to be honest about the actual hours that something takes to do. We don't want to look incompetent. We don't want to brag. We are like, well, what is work when you do ministry? Maybe it's just me loving what I do. Like, I get all that. These are the games that I've played growing up as a ministry leader. But here's the thing. If we can be honest about the actual hours that we spend on things, it's a much more honest expression of the work that we're doing by volume, and also the work that we do by priority. And what you may find is, personally, you may need to adjust the way that you are using the hours that you have in young adult ministry. That's a great check for yourself. But even more importantly is this, and I tell leaders this all the time: your supervisors can't advocate for you if you're not honest about the work that you're doing. If you're giving 20 hours a week to young adult ministry, if that's what you've budgeted, but you're actually spending 30 hours on that, there's an injustice there. You're either taking away from something else that's expected of you, or you're actually working for free, and that's not really fair to you. So an honest expression of the hours that you're working to share that with your supervisor gives them a clear picture of perhaps something that needs to change in your job description, or maybe you need another part-time person, or you need an intern, or they need to take something else off your plate so that you can be true to what you've been asked to do. These are the honest conversations, the courageous conversations that you need to have in order to stay focused on the work that you're doing. So I hope that this piece helps you. On top of that, like I said before, most churches and organizations don't seem to have a very robust budget. This is my philosophy on budgets. To be really honest with you. Budgets are vision statements. They're like your magnum opus, where you are like basically taking this thing and you are saying, this is where we're going, and this is the funding that we need to fuel it. Okay. Now, you don't always get your budget, which you hope for, but I think if you can communicate to the leaders in your church that I need this budget to accomplish this, that leadership is more apt to give you your budget because it has a purpose and a goal associated with it. If you just give them we need $5,000 for what? Well, youth, young adult things. That's not very compelling. And usually that money will go to somewhere else. The more specific you can be, the more visionary and purposeful you can be about the work that you're doing, it really, really helps. So like this first one, like you might be like, I need $1,000 for coffee and meals. And they might be like, coffee and meals, what do you mean? You can say, look, one of the best ways to connect with young adults is one-on-one. They're more apt to have those conversations than in large groups. And because they're coming and going with their work, it's a better chance for me to keep them connected with the church through relationship. I make time for that. And they're more apt also to go out for coffee if I tell them that I'll buy their coffee. Oh, that makes sense. And my goal, because there's 1,000 of them, my goal is to have X amount of conversations each month. And I can't wait to report back on that. Oh, okay. You see how you do that? So use this budget as a way not to just like get money, but to share your vision for what you hope to do with it. And I think what you'll find is that people are much more open to your proposals than otherwise. So again, this is in the appendices. I hope it helps you and gives you a bit more definition along the way. Okay, so let's talk about it really quick. Who can you relate to in these personas? Maybe just take a minute and kind of say, man, I can really relate to full-time Felicity, or one of the other ones. Maybe there's a combination of a couple. That's fine too. But maybe just take a minute and think about that, and just recognize the fact that you're not alone. Secondly, what does your job description look like, and how might you need to update it? Like, seriously, like when's the last time you really looked at your job description? Does it really reflect what you're doing? What do you need to do to update it? Or what conversation do you need to have? I really encourage you to do that and not take that lightly. That's part of ministry. It's part of being a leader. And I think it's a great thing for you. And then also, what kind of budget could you develop that advocates for a vision for supporting young adults? Like, what if you really took the time to actually think about this budget and a visionary one that can actually advocate for young adults? I think you have an opportunity to do that. And perhaps we can move the needle on how much budget young adult ministries actually have. So I hope that helps you. I think there's some good things to think about here, and hopefully it also just inspires the conversations you're going to have with leaders in your church.